Morathi is the most interesting character in modern Warhammer, and a great example of what I find so compelling about Age of Sigmar in the first place. Imagine if an iconic Disney villain, let's say Maleficent, had her world completely and destroyed by the gods of chaos. But instead of dying alongside her world, she was swallowed up by one of these eldritch chaos gods. And then, after stewing in its stomach for millennia, she was vomited up into a brand new world of strangeness and magic. But she was not untouched by this experience. Her body had changed. She was now a bat-winged snake monster, all alone in this new world. And when she searched for her people, she found none, only other monsters, and the few beings iconic or magical enough to have survived the death of their shared world. And so, she was forced to team up with Sleeping Beauty, Mickey Mouse, Jack Skellington, and a bunch of other iconic characters that have existed for a very long time. This is the story of Morathi. How to paint giant snake women, and why. When Morathi was revived in the New World and became accustomed to her new form, she was ashamed of it, and found a way to use her magics to transform herself into her old beautiful form. This is why in the game she is represented by these two models. One representing her actual self, and the other representing the illusion she presents to her followers and allies. This week I was tasked with painting both Morathis as a commission project for one of my lovely patrons, who has been patiently waiting for me to finish these for him. So why is Morathi my favorite character in all of Warhammer? Well, it's because she's the underdog. She's a villain from a fairy tale taken out of her original context and forced to fend for herself. Instead of being redeemed, like many of these villains would in this kind of story, she only gets worse, because those around her judge her based on her past deeds and monstrous appearance. If she had had even one friend to actually confide in, or even better, if she had just gone to therapy, maybe Games Workshop wouldn't have had to write Broken Realms Morathi. The biggest challenge on this project was its size. Much like Morathi's ego, this was quite possibly the largest model I've ever painted. But I still approached it just like I would any other figure, starting off with a value sketch to highlight and shade as many details as I could before I started to apply color to the models. My goal here was to do as much groundwork as I could ahead of time with shades and highlights so that I wouldn't have to worry about it later. This also gave me a lot of time to contemplate the model and think about what colors I would use. Like me, Morathi also had a lot of time to contemplate her plans for this new world. Slowly, she would find a few elves in this world who are willing to follow her, and self-styling herself as the high priestess of the elven god of murder, she would found her own Warhammer faction, the Daughters of Cain. Once I was satisfied with my value sketch, I started adding color to the figure. Because this was a commission piece, and I had to match the rest of an existing army, some of the decisions were already made for me. I had already painted all of the Meluside scales in a seafoam green color, so I decided to do the same with Morathi, as well as the snakes in her hair to match. Once that was done, I still wasn't exactly sure what colors I wanted to use for the rest of the figure, but I was sure I wanted it to have a relatively warm tone. So I started off with a light coat of magenta ink over all of the skin areas. Here you can see all the work I did ahead of time coming back to help me. As the undershading gets its coat of magenta, we can really see the whole figure start to come together. Yet next I used Wrap 2 yellow ink to transform some of the magenta areas on the model into orange, red, and peach colored tones. I then used this same yellow ink to tint some parts of our cyan colored areas, adding some variety, as well as bringing this color more into our desired seafoam green range. I find using just the 3 primary colors can be a great place to start if you don't know exactly where you're going, because no matter what you do, you'll end up with a more vibrant result for using them as a starting point. Much like myself, Morathi started with just the basics when crafting her new army. She found and rescued the souls of dead elves, like Crosswood, Untap Upkeep Dredge, Brett Cameron, Heather E. Thompson, and Asa Linson, which coincidentally are also the names of some very generous patrons who've donated to my Patreon this past month. So thank you very much for that. She took these elven souls that had been swallowed up by the demon god Slanesh and created beings in her own image, although like her, they ended up slightly corrupted, having demonic features like snake bodies or bat wings. Although none of the other factions really liked Morathi or her monstrous forces, none could deny that they were effective, and could always be relied on to help fight the evil forces of chaos. Morathi continued to be helpful to her allies, but all the while Morathi and her daughters plotted behind everyone's backs, lying in wait to finally make their move on the mortal realms. With my base colors blocked in with the airbrush, I went to my desk and started working on the metallics. I didn't have a gold color that I really liked for this, so I ended up mixing copper and gold together to paint all of Morathi's armor. I then used a silver paint to paint some of the blades and highlight the highest points on the gold armor, followed up by a selective violet wash to give the metallics some depth. I used a bit of this on the flesh and other parts of the model as well to give everything a consistent tone. With all of our main details in place, I spent some time working on Morathi's skin tone, using techniques from my recent skin video, as well as adding highlights and shadows to various parts of the model. One of the challenges and one of the high points of working on such a large model is that it's never really done. It's just finished whenever you want to stop painting. Once all of the groundwork was laid down, my only real 2 steps were to add more pale sand highlights, and then use glazes of color to dim those down to their normal color. I spent several hours doing this on multiple parts of the model, but it's not very interesting to talk about, so instead I'd like to tell you about my thoughts on Morathi's first solo album, Broken Realms Morathi. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Morathi is, unlike some of the other factions and characters in Age of Sigmar, she actually evolves and changes, making moves that shape the world around her. While the world of Warhammer typically doesn't evolve or change very quickly, and it really can't because the company wants your game pieces to be able to be used over and over again, in the latest story and rules supplement, Broken Realms Morathi, she changes the whole world and its dynamic at a rapid pace. Without spoiling too much of the story in this new book, it's about her ascent to godhood, and in the events of this, she changes the status quo quite significantly, including which factions are allied with which other factions, her own rules as a game piece, and even going so far as to take over one of the main locations in the world, renaming it and claiming it as the new Dark Elf capital of the world. It's quite an engaging read, and it makes me happy to see Games Workshop taking such risks and changing things within their own games and narrative. It feels very much like being a part of an ongoing MMO with a storyline that changes the state of the world every few months. So, if you're an old Dark Elf fan from the fantasy days and you're thinking of giving Age of Sigmar a try, now is the time to get back in. The Dark Elves have their very own home city now in the form of Har Kuran, and you can use all of your old models in both Age of Sigmar as well as Warcry. That's the skirmish game that everyone likes more than Age of Sigmar if you've been out of the loop for a while. You don't even really have to rebase your figures unless you're playing in a tournament, which I can't really see you doing anytime soon. So that's pretty much everything I have to say for today about this painting guide. I could spend probably another 100 hours refining all of the highlights and shadows on Morathi, but unfortunately this project and this video had to get wrapped up at some point. So I guess that point is right now. With Morathi complete, I feel pretty happy with how she turned out. This was my first really big model, and I have to say I'm rather sad to see her go and that I have to send this off to the person who paid me to paint her. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all of you who are supporting the production of these videos on Patreon. It really means a lot to me that so many of you have chosen to support me over there, So a huge thanks again to all of you. If you're a new player and you think the Daughters of Cain sound cool, check out Morgweith's Blade Coven. It's a cheap set that gives you a full warband of amazing sculpts, which you can use to play Warhammer Underworlds or Warcry. Or maybe consider checking out the new Daughters of Cain Battle Tome, which looks like it's going to contain some amazing art and more details on all the lore that I just glossed over in this video. I hope you enjoyed this video about the most interesting character in Warhammer, and I'll see you in the next video.